So I was led astray by my own mind into the wastelands of the secular world that we're in, and I felt compelled to get up here and tell you about that. But folks, I gotta be honest, this is the hardest talk I've ever had to give. And I was thinking two reasons. Number one, some of you may have noticed I've got a little bit of a hammy actor tendency. And the great Sir Laurence Olivier once was asked, what's the actor's creed? What are they in it for? And the problem is, his answer was, look at me, 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 look at me. I don't want you to look at me. I don't know a whole lot of you, but I care about all of you. What a precious group of souls. I want you to look at God. I don't want you to look at me. But what a paradox. What a camel to put through an eye of the needle. I'm up here, I have to be, but I want you to look at God, not at me. So let's see if we can figure this thing out, okay? The other reason this is hard is I've never given a talk like this before. I was a practicing atheistic scientist for a number of years. I've given plenty of those talks, but this is something of basically a testimony. And to my knowledge, there's not a lot of precedent for that in the Urantia movement, getting up here and saying something like that. But thankfully, I was inspired, led, to think about leaning on our Christian tradition. Paper 195 after Pentecost reminds us, do not discard the river of truth flowing to us from our forebears. 2,000 years. The Christians know how to give testimony. They've got forms for it. So I looked some of this stuff up, and I want to tell you what life was like before I came back, when I was in this wilderness, the wasteland, what it was like to come back, what that looked like, and what life has been like since. So, I can't stop now. I've traveled so far to change this lonely life. I like rocks. Turns out I like geology. And it turns out there are people in the world who will pay you to like rocks if you can solve the kinds of problems that rocks are prone to having in the world. And they do. So I went to grad school in my mid-20s for geology. And, it was a very intense time. It was 2.5 years. I wanted my master's degree in a straight 2.5 years. And here we go. And so there wasn't a whole lot of time for God. I went there with the Urantia book under my shoulder. I had grown up with this thing. My parents read it. I was devoutly reading it. But days were filled with all this stuff about rocks and all these facts about aqueous geochemistry and isotopes. So I wasn't thinking about God a whole lot, but I guess I figured, well, that'll work out okay. But I noticed my mind drifting away from God a little bit. I found one of the professors in the department who was a quiet but known Christian. And I went to him at a crucial time in my development, and I asked him, Professor, how do you reconcile your Christian faith with what we're learning here in this department where we never talk about God? And I emailed it to him, and this is actually an excerpt of what this professor, this Yoda-like figure who I looked up to, said to me. The moment we get into cosmic issues, Brad, or the cosmos as interpreted religiously, or anything beyond our infinitesimal selves, we're facing a reality we don't understand. There's no way to know. He took Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping magisteria position. Science is here, religion is here, nary the twain shall meet. Brad, let's talk about rocks. Rocks are fun. They'll pay you to think about rocks. Nothing to see here. Not a very satisfying answer, but I'm learning. I'm the student, and he's the teacher, so there you go. A little further down the road, I, at another crucial moment, asked a fellow who would have to sign the paperwork to give me my diploma. I went to his office and I asked him, Professor, I see the letters PhD as something that people aspire for here, and maybe that's something I'm interested in, but I've heard that means Doctor of Philosophy. Why do we call the highest achievement in geology philosophy? And he leaned back in his chair and he said, well, Brad, that is an antiquated notion. That's from the 19th century. It's a carryover of Victorian science, and we're actually trying to get rid of that. Pay no attention. Philosophy is dead. There's no such thing as philosophy in geology. This is all technical practice. Get back to the lab, collect your data. We're doing science. Now, I knew better at that time. I'd read the Urantia book. I knew that philosophy was somehow the unifier, the aid in unifying science and religion. But, this guy was going to sign my paperwork. I guess I had to go along with it, drift with that material current. And so I began to drift further and further, and I began to observe the geologists in the department, my colleagues, my friends, my peers. I started dressing like them, drinking like them, like a fish. And before I knew it, I had become arrogant in a whole new way. In my early 20s, I had some spiritual arrogance. I think we've all probably had a little trouble with that. Anyone feel like they know more than Christians? Yeah. But I developed an atheistic arrogance. I began to mock religionists. I wouldn't miss an opportunity to say, oh, these ignorant people, they think Genesis is actually meaningful. It's just Babylonian myth. And I began to resemble what Jesus said about the betrayer. How deceitful is the intellectual pride that precedes the spiritual downfall, he said of Judas Iscariot. And that was my downfall that was coming. So you might ask, is there any kind of spiritual practice, anything that's allowed by the mores of an atheistic science department out there? A little bit. They'll give you a vague pantheism. That's okay. As long as it's sentimental and it's sweet and it's innocuous and it's kept at arm's length. Nothing dangerous here. Certainly not something that's going to give you strong religious convictions. What do they say about strong religious convictions with the moderns in paper 195? We don't like them, so we crystallize. We keep at arm's length. So that became my spirituality. And quite before I knew what had happened, my spiritual practice looked something like this. This is at a crucial moment in my young adult life, and that is a hawk feather dispelling bad juju. Now, that's sweet, that's sentimental. We love, oh, hawks, they're beautiful, they fly up in the air, aren't they powerful? Isn't that positive? Oh, doesn't it feel so good? That hawk feather is not salvation. That hawk feather will not be the God of Isaac and Abraham, I am that I am. It's just a hawk feather. So, we can't be surprised, though. The dread of falling under the dominance of strong religious convictions scares us, and we drift away, or at least the wider world does. We are in a room here where we have the power to not drift away. But I did, into the wastelands. And oddly, studying the art of the testimony from our Christian brethren, our brothers and sisters in the Christian faith, they say, don't focus too much on the negative. Don't focus on what came before. See, I thought this whole talk was going to be a laundry list of what not to do, what you ought to watch out for. They say it's more powerful to focus on what came after. How did God find you again when you were lost? So let's not tarry here, but let's remember what weary King Solomon said in Ecclesiastes in the Wastelands, and so I hated life, because everything done under the sun was grievous to me. That's what life began to feel like to me. And I've been keeping a journal since I was a kid on the computer, and I had enough presence of mind as life began to fall apart and nothing seemed to serve me well to write this in my journal. As I felt myself drifting toward atheism and even sometimes nihilism, any ideas that I might have something useful to say or contribute have been greatly diminished, which deep down I know is not where I want to be in my inner life. Or put more succinctly, in heaven's name, what am I doing? The coyote, that was me. I was a fool about to get a lesson in gravity falling off of a cliff. So at least there was enough of a nucleus in me to have this presence of mind. How many of our brothers and sisters in this world, or our children, don't stop and think about this and reflect and say, something's not going right. I better be just brave and noble enough to turn about and go right, having taken the wrong path, like Simon Peter did. So something happened. I reached this low point, and Thankfully, there was humility there. The soil essential for religious growth presupposes normal consciousness of smallness, humility. In my darkest night, I started to pray. Those lyrics are true. And strangely, I took a weekend, and for 36 hours, I stopped talking. I said, universe, whoever's out there, pantheistic, everything, nothing, I'm all out of words. They're not serving me well, but if someone has something to say to me, I'm listening. And here's the strange thing of record. Something spoke, and it shouldn't have, objectively speaking. This is Thunder Mountain in Sedona, Arizona. Now, nature worship and reverence of unity are not the worship of God. Pantheism is not objectively real, and yet, as I sat for 36 hours not talking, 1,500 miles away from Thunder Mountain, something I called the Spirit of the West spoke to me, conducted through the rocks across the continent, and met me there. Exactly the framework that a geologist, a guy who likes rocks, would need. What grace do we have that God and the angels will stop at nothing to reach the lost sheep, even if they have to condescend to the level of primitive nature worship? I mean, here's my hawk feather, yay! But it worked. Now, what was said to me is beyond words. I found I couldn't put it into words here, but it got me moving again. And then life began to improve. And again, God was reaching me through the aegis of some worldly forces. I found a psychologist who was himself, as far as I know, not overtly religious, but he was mythological in character. And Andre yesterday told us about psychologists. He is a Jungian psychologist, so he introduced me to the unconscious mind and dreams. And he's also really into Joseph Campbell, so he introduced me to the hero's journey, the archetype of maybe you could get your life together and be some kind of hero and answer the call. And so for a couple of years, I imagined, what if I was Luke Skywalker looking out at the binary sunset, feeling the call to some adventure, some romance. And then that worked. Our mind can deceive us, but our mind is also powerful enough to give us these constructs, these stories, these ways to think of ourselves in this world and make some sense of it. But I began to tire of this because at some point you just discover you shouldn't be the shiniest object in the universe. You're gazing at your navel all the time. You're your own hero. I wanted God at the center. So another thing that happened, I came upon a class taught by one of the Urantia book reader, Chris Halverson, called Reawakening Philosophy. And this class was a clarion bell refutation of, bless his heart, that fool of a professor who told me that philosophy is dead. Well, unfortunately, it is these days. That was the scientific dictation he was giving me. But Chris Halverson's class told me, no, let's reawaken philosophy. Let's dust off this 100-year-old textbook with the rudiments of philosophy right out of the Greek and Western tradition and see what do we have to know about philosophy. My days started becoming richer, life more purposeful. Then I got, coincidentally, an opportunity to inherit the co-hosting position on this long-running podcast called Symmetry of Soul. Andrea Barnes is also one of my co-hosts. So I got to start thinking and talking about the Urantia book on a weekly basis, and I've been there for 8 years now. Days became richer. Life became more meaningful. There was purpose, and I began to dust off these layers of dust that had accumulated, and the dust was full of dead men's bones and all sorts of uncleanness, I dusted it away, and I asked, well, this is the inner life I'm talking about, right? Dust had covered things in my inner life, and I dusted it off, and I said, well, is there anything still here? There was, but it was broken, it was cracked. Things had been damaged by this time in the secular wastelands. But I found, through the grace of God, there's a way to heal even cracked and broken things. I find it very appealing, the Japanese art of kintsugi. It says you can take a broken piece of pottery or earthenware and you can mend it using solid gold and make it whole again. And the cracks will always be there, but they themselves become part of the artwork itself. And that's what life began to feel like for me. I felt like a mended clay pot. But those scars are always going to be there. And I'm here today, a product of those scars. Now, maybe someday, first stage spirit, new body, new form, not even your Urantia soul, maybe those things get forgotten in eternity. I don't know. It's not my business. But they're here now, and they've helped shape me. If you're not into pottery, another metaphor, they're everywhere. In Lord of the Rings, Frodo gets a wound at Weathertop, stabbed by a supernatural weapon. And what does Gandalf say about it? The wound will never heal properly. He'll carry it with him all of his days. I've got something of a supernatural wound, and I think I'm probably not alone here. Maybe someone here today is thinking about a supernatural wound that they have, that they allowed themselves to be wounded by, but can it be mended? Can God work with that and turn it into something good, something beautiful? Yeah. But the last thing I want to tell you is you've got to be vigilant. Vigilance, brothers and sisters, is the price we must pay for this kind of epical revelation, this knowledge, this revelation we've been given. Paper 195, Section 8 warns us that this world is decidedly secular, and even as late as just a few years ago, it takes years to unwind this stuff. Just a few years ago, I, as a co-host of Symmetry of Soul and an ardent reader of the Urantia book, marched in the March for Science in Washington in 2017. Like science, I still had my government job as a scientist. What's the problem? The problem is at the front of the march is one of the most militant, rabid atheists on the planet today who says, I really believe in science. It is a faith. It is a reverence akin to religion. Bill Nye is not in favor of religionists, and I was marching in step with Bill Nye just a few years ago. What was I thinking? This stuff takes years to unwind, and we must always be vigilant. So, now, again, as weary King Solomon might say, or the teacher would say, now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, for God will bring into judgment even every hidden thing that is both good and evil. Serve God first, and then your service to man will flow naturally from that. Thank you.